While we focus every day on the here and now, eternity awaits us. Those who know Christ have a glorious future ahead of them. The doorway to heaven is the death of the believer. When Stephen was martyred, he had a vision of Jesus welcoming him home. For those who fear death, this can be your vision as well. Stay with us. From Chicago's Moody Church, this is Running to Win with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, whose clear teaching helps us make it across the finish line. Turn with us to Acts chapter 6. Erwin Lutzer comes again to teach us that when God is first, He owns our future. And what a future that will be.
It says regarding the saints, they shall reign with Him forever and ever. We receive the victory of Jesus. We are crowned by Jesus. C.S. Lewis said, death opens a door out of our little dark room into the great real place where the true sun shines and where we shall meet. When you weep at a funeral, know who you're weeping for. Weep for yourself and for others, and it's perfectly legitimate and right to do that because we miss them. But don't weep for the Christian who's gone to heaven. Oh, no, don't weep for them. Because they're okay. It's like Tony Evans says, I hope you have a good time at my funeral, he said, because I'm not going to be there. And I'm not planning to be at mine either, as a matter of fact. And you're not going to be at yours. We'd all like to think that somebody might show up for it, but we're not going to be there. There's a third blessing that is received, the blessing of the welcome. There's the blessing of the crowning, the victory. There's also the blessing of receiving the will of Jesus. Now, we don't have time to go into this today because you've heard me speak about this so many times, God's providence in our death. Was Stephen simply the victim of some evil people who sprang on him, arrested him, and stoned him, and dragged him out of the city, killed him, threw his body away? Although the body was given to the Christians, we learn later. Is that really the way you read history? No. Stephen belonged to Jesus, and he died within God's providential will. As we shall see in a moment, some good came out of his death. And sometimes God takes people who are older, sometimes He takes people who are younger. I'm reminded of Jim Elliot, who died as a martyr. As a young man, he said, God is peopling heaven. Why should He limit Himself to old people? I mean, if God is peopling heaven, if His children are so dear to Him, and it does say precious in the sight of the Lord are the death of His saints. If His children are so dear to Him, He takes them sometimes even at young ages. Now, the Bible says, unless a corn of wheat falls into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it dies, it bears fruit. I want you to notice very briefly two effects of Stephen's death. For a man by the name of Saul, Stephen's death meant salvation. Notice what the text says, that the witnesses, I'm in verse 58, meanwhile the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul, this young, brilliant rabbi, Saul. And the reason that they laid their garments there is because they knew that he could be trusted. They took off the clothes. You know, it's hard to throw stones when you have a thick robe on. And they gave it to Saul. And Saul, as a result of all of that, even became more angry and persecuted the church. Eventually he's converted and he turns into the Apostle Paul. He's renamed. And years later, just before he died, he said in Acts chapter 22, he said, I was such a great sinner because he says, I consented to the death of Stephen. You know that Paul could never get over Stephen's death. I think there were two things that haunted him. First of all, Stephen's face, which was like the face of an angel in the midst of all of these people who hated him. That was the first thing. And then the second thing is, look at the way in which Stephen prayed. And he said, Lord, I'm now in verse 60. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. That's the way a true Christian dies. You say, well, Did God answer this prayer? Yes, God answered the prayer for those people whom God intended to save. It was a prayer that was answered in the life of the Apostle Paul and others. It was not a blanket prayer that was applied to everyone as if God would not hold them accountable. But there were some people for whom the sin was not laid to their charge. And Paul was one. So on the one hand, Stephen's death helped Paul to understand the gospel. And he never forgot it. There's another response. For Paul, it was salvation. For the nation of Israel, it was condemnation. Condemnation. You remember Jesus had predicted that not one stone would be left upon another in the temple. And that's exactly what happened. Because in 70 A.D., Titus came and surrounded the city, and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in the most horrific way with a sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of lives brutally murdered. And Jesus said that that was happening because you did not know the day of your visitation. Stephen's death was just another nail, so to speak, in this coffin. Isn't it true that funerals do the same today? You are either drawn closer to Jesus. I've seen unsaved people attend a funeral, and for that moment there's an openness there and a willingness to be drawn to Jesus as they weep. But on the other hand, there are some people who may weep, but their heart only becomes harder. They become angry with God. God, why did you do this? I can't figure God out, and if I can't figure God out, I'm not going to trust Him. And instead of becoming softer to the truth, they actually become harder to the truth. What are the two lessons we can learn from the death of Stephen? He received the welcome of Jesus. He was crowned by Jesus, and he received the will of Jesus. God's purpose was accomplished in his life. And we're talking about making God first. A year or so ago, I read the book by Viktor Frankl entitled Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book that all of you should read. It is a remarkable book of life in a concentration